right, hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm Dale, you're the Real Seeker, and this is an old show. It's one of the old Skeptics and Seekers Shroud Wars debates. I actually wasn't in this episode. It's a debate between Teddi Pappas and the Shroud skeptic Hugh Farey. And just wanted to post this up in honor of the fact that both Teddy and myself were on the Pora podcast, Proselytize or Apostatize, as well as the Complete Sinner's Guide podcast, presenting some of the data on the Shroud of Turin, and that was new for their audience, so that was a great opportunity to kind of introduce some of the scholarly work and respond to some of the popular level objections to the Shroud there. In that debate, we kind of mentioned Teddy's debate with Hugh here, so I just wanted to post that up for people of Real Seekers as well, because I know that you guys love the Shroud material. So this will kind of be a bonus podcast alongside the show that I was on with Teddy yesterday. So with that said, enjoy this debate and enjoy the Complete Sinner's Guide podcast that I'll be posting up shortly as well. All right, take care.
Well, hello, and welcome to yet another exciting episode of Skeptics and Seekers. I'm your host, David the Skeptic, and this is Skeptics and Seekers Special Edition. Don't call it Shroud Wars, call it the Shroud Wars Reboot, because we have two completely different opponents in the cage. On my left, she is sometimes known as the Bear. Teddy, how are you?
Doing well. Grrr.
And to my right, we have every Shroudie's nemesis, Hugh Farey. Hugh, how are you?
I'm absolutely fine, thanks.
Great. Normally, I would give people a chance to introduce themselves, but neither of you need introductions to this audience. And so, I am David, and I will be mostly quiet and out of the way for this show, because we are talking about the Shroud, and I don't know enough, and I don't think I care enough. These guys are going to make me care, though, a little bit. And helping me moderate, Mr. Darren, I will not mention his dreaded nickname. Darren is going to help me moderate this subject because he is quite a bit more knowledgeable on it. And afterward, if all goes well, Darren and I will do an after show where he explains to me all of the things that I didn't understand during this conversation. And so, Darren, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good.
Excellent. All right. So let me just set things up here. First of all, we're not going to cover all of the Shroud of Turin in this one episode. Forget about it. It's not possible. But what I want to do is to see if we can't set up this conversation as maybe the first in a series of conversations. Let's see how this goes. On reasonableness. And so I want to build this as why it is reasonable to not believe in the Shroud of Turin, and or why it is not reasonable to disbelieve in the Shroud of Turin, depending on your perspective. I want to know if we can get down to a reasonable position, because I know that Teddy, for instance, has said many times on the board, and it's riled many of us up on the skeptic side, that it is simply unreasonable to not believe in the Shroud of Turin. So I want to give her a chance to defend that. And I want Hugh Farey to tell us why she's wrong and why it is, in fact, reasonable not to believe. I am going to give you why, just a very brief sketch on why I can't be bothered much with the Shroud of Turin, in case there are some of you who do not know my position. There are a number of reasons, but I would say the most basic reason is I was raised to be a biblical theologian. And so things begin when, in matters of theology, it begins with the Bible for me. And so I have to first look at the Bible and see if what is being said about theology today makes sense of the literature that it's supposed to be from. And so I'm very much Bible as a piece of literature guy, and trying to understand what the authors were saying, what the hearers would have heard, in that sort of thing. And when I look at the burial shroud in the Bible, there are a couple of verses that give a description. And let's see, John chapter 20, verse 5 through 7. I'll just read a couple of bits of that. He bent down, this is Peter, he bent down and saw the strips, plural, of linen cloth lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter, who had been following him, arrived, I guess that wasn't Peter, arrived and went right into the tomb. He saw the strips, again, plural, of linen cloth lying there, 7, and the face cloth, which had been around Jesus' head, not lying with the strips, again, plural, of linen cloth, but rolled up into one place. The first thing I notice when I look at the Bible for this shroud, this burial cloth of Jesus, is that it's described as multiple strips of linen, not one 14 by 4 piece. And then there's a head cloth. And so once again, I have no idea why we're talking about a single piece with a single image when that's not how it's described in the Bible. Now, this is one of many things, but this is the first place that I come to, and I simply don't recognize today's Shroud of Turin as a biblical artifact. And so that would be one reason. This is not, I just want to say for fairness, this is not what we're talking about today. We're talking about very specifically whether the image is man-made, or at least whether it's reasonable to believe that the image is man-made or not. And so this is not the issue today, but I just wanted to present it to give the audience a little bit of an idea of why I don't even really get started with the Shroud. It just it doesn't resonate for me as something that is in line with what the Bible says. I was not a Shroudie when I was a Christian. I would have said that, like many Christians today, that the emphasis on the Shroud, especially the particular Shroud that we have, is not only a mistake, but it might even be satanic. It might be some form of idolatry. So, at any rate, that's me. And with that, I think that I am going to give the first slice of this to Teddi. She might want to respond to what I said, or she might just want to ignore what I said and jump right into the topic that she's here to talk about. So with no further ado, let the games begin.
Oh, no, David, you know I'm going to respond. So I find it, first of all, quite curious and amusing that you would be looking to the details of what the Bible has to say, given that you're now an atheist, and given how you like to challenge different aspects of what the Bible says. And we all know that with the Bible having been translated into different languages, as well as different versions of the Bible, words and stuff, they matter. And sometimes they have been altered. So one of the things that I have read, and because that wasn't really the topic for today, I don't have everything in front of me, but just going off of my memory, I've looked into this aspect or challenge to the Shroud, and when I had looked into it, it falls away as a legitimate argument against it. In terms of the strips, I think it's the NIV version of the Bible that terms it that way. But even if you're gonna go with that definition, there was a chin band or a band around the jaw to keep the mouth closed of the body. And a lot of times scholars have referred to that V shape, inverted V shape in the beard in the image as that having altered how the beard is laying because of the chin strap. And also when you look to the side of the head, there's a little bit of a mashing of it, which seems to evidence the chin strap being there. So some people have said that also that there may have been some tying of the legs just to keep them together and closed. So the other thing is that when you go to the original Greek, which of course the New Testament was written in Greek, which I do speak, being a Greek American. My mom forced me to go to Greek school and once a week, and so I do speak Greek. The word, I believe, I think it was how it was written in Greek, is syndon, and syndon means a sheet. And I remember when I had investigated this whole particular topic, in the Greek, a sheet or a syndon can be something that they were even describing. It could be something like on a sailboat, or something small. So the idea that strips like an Egyptian mummy would be wrapped in that wouldn't. We're not confined to that definition, which again I think is partly a mistranslation of what the original Greek was. But Hugh, what do you say on that?
You want me to come back on that? Right. Well, firstly, let's go to David, who jumps on St. John. And for some reason, the Gospel of St. John is a great one thing that everyone picks on because it mentions the events happening around about resurrection time, perhaps a bit more than all of the others. But the other three Gospels don't mention the Greek for strips, which is orthonia. They mention this syndon that you were mentioning. And a syndon is a big sheet. You're quite right. It is John who doesn't mention syndon. It is John who mentions orthonia, which definitely means strips. Now, the thing about the strips that orthonia means is it very much depends what you mean by the word strips. It sometimes used in Greek texts to mean bandages, which is obviously long and thin. And it also can be used to mean swaddling bands, because they used to truss their babies up like mummies. But it's also used by some of the classical Greek authors to be sailcloth, rolls of cloth that people would take on their ships. And then if one of the sails broke, they would take it down and sew another strip on. And those strips were probably a meter wide. So orthonia can mean wide, big strips, as well as little strips. However, if you want my personal opinion, I don't think John was there, and I don't think John knew. I don't associate, probably David would know more about this than me, but I don't think John the Evangelist was John the beloved disciple. What's more, although his gospel does show quite remarkable knowledge of the geography of Jerusalem, I don't think he had any idea what the Jewish practices were, and I think he got them wrong. And what's more, when he mentions things like myrrh and aloes, according to the custom of the Jews, piling your body high with myrrh and aloes was not the custom of the Jews. So I think he was making that up. Now, there's a controversial thing to say.
Well, I just like the fact that you and I are kind of tag teaming against David. So we'll see how long that lasts, but I'm enjoying it while it is happening.
Okay, so that's my take on orthonia and syndon.
Okay. We will just leave that there because I am not a part of the debate. So I will just say I find those explanations possible, maybe even plausible, but I don't find them definitive. And if the argument is, well, some of the people in the Bible who talked about it didn't know what they were talking about, I think that's a bigger problem. I think that leaves the Christian torpedoing the authenticity of John in order to save the the shroud, and I think that's a bad trait theologically.
Isn't that just more of an issue if you're kind of becoming, or if you're being more of an inerrantist, or you can be a Christian and not necessarily think that everything in the Bible is as it is translated to be in these different versions of the Bible that we have. For example, there can be independent reasons without having to know all of the minutia or necessarily have all of the minutia in the Bible be 100% accurate and still believe in God. So how about we take the David Hume approach and let's take a look at the evidence with this shroud and see where the evidence starts going, and see in which direction it starts going.
Very good. You can have the first bite of the apple, Teddy.
All right. Well, in terms of, do you want me? I'm not sure how you want me to do this.
Do you have an opening statement?
Not really a full one. I can give you one extemporaneously.
Very well. You're here to talk about the image in particular, but overall for this series, the reasonableness of why it's reasonable to believe, and moreover why it's not reasonable to not believe. And so, if you want to address the overall theme or go straight into the specific topic, I will leave it up to you.
Okay. All right. Well, just kind of a little bit of a background in case somebody's listening who is not overly familiar with the Shroud of Turin. And it always surprises me how many people have never even heard of it. But the Shroud of Turin, it's the purported burial cloth of Jesus. It's a piece of linen that is approximately 14 and a half feet by 3.5 feet. And it has a body image on it that is very, very faint, kind of a straw yellow color. And there are red images on it that are obviously meant to convey the appearance of blood. And so there are a great many people who believe that this is the authentic burial shroud of Jesus, and there's a tradition that goes back to Constantinople and even earlier, where people have thought that there was this cloth that was not made by human hands that had this image of Jesus on it. And, hopefully, I think you and I had talked about maybe getting into the timeline and all that on a different show, because there is just such a huge amount of information concerning the shroud. But anyway, but there are also a great many people who think that this was a fake, and especially when in 1988, the radiocarbon dating came out, and was saying that the shroud, that the age of the shroud was somewhere between 1260 to 1390, planting it into the medieval time period. Everybody and their mother started saying that, the shroud, it was something created by a medieval forger. And then you got the whole Darcy memo, which, I'm going to poo-poo that whole thing because, and that's just where this guy that had sour grapes, the big story in and of itself. But anyway, since when, especially among skeptics, does one person saying something about something else count as evidence, just in and of itself, especially when they have a strong motivation to say something negative about something. Anyway, we can get into that with a different show, but anyway, so this whole medieval forger hypothesis is what many skeptics tend to think, that the Shroud of Turin is a forgery. And there are some people who think that, no, it's not a forgery. Maybe it is the burial cloth of another crucifixion victim. Well, that's not really the topic. And hopefully we will have a discussion on that too, in terms of whether this is Jesus's burial cloth. But I think from what we had talked about, what we're talking about today is whether or not this is a man-made item. This whole image, in terms of the body image and the blood images, if that was made by human hands, or if it is not. And so, if it was naturally created without somebody trying to create it in terms of artifice. So I think that's kind of where a little bit of an overview about it. And David, I don't know, shall we let Hugh say something before we get into all the nuts and bolts of it?
Sure. Go ahead, Hugh.
Right. First of all, there are mentions of the shroud. First of all, in the Bible. Well, there is a shroud in the Bible, and of course, there was a great craze for relics of all kinds. So it's hardly surprising that burial shrouds turn up in Constantinople as well, and they're occasionally mentioned as being there. So there's the fact that the word shroud connected with Jesus turns up before the Middle Ages is not at all surprising. However, never, ever, ever is there any suggestion that the word shroud or burial cloth is connected with image. There are any number of mentions of image, and there are any number of mentions of burial cloths, but they are never, ever, ever connected together. And that, I think, would be quite a useful weapon in an authenticist's armory, but it doesn't exist. Then we get the Achairopoetus, or however it's pronounced. Teddy's Greek's probably better than mine. But this means an image not made by human hands. Well, it means anything not made by humans' hands. And there are, I think, at this moment, you can go and see at least 5 of them, including a particularly ugly wooden statue, which I think is in Portugal or Spain. And, of course, the Virgin of Guadalupe and things like that. They're all claimed to be not made by human hands. And the point about them is that almost all of them, the ones that you can see clearly, are most definitely made by human hands. So how did they get the idea that they were not made by human hands? It wasn't because they had some mysterious characteristics. It was because they had the provenance of somebody said they're not made by human hands. And if somebody in authority says that, people believe it. The Veronica paintings and the Mandelion of Odessa was often, which might be associated with them, was quite clearly a painting, and probably had great lumps of paint on it and flaking off. But it was considered not made by human hands. It was a miraculous painting. You don't have to have some blurred and indistinct marks on a sheet in order to be Achairopoetus. Now back to Darcy, Bishop Darcy of Troy, who may or may not have written a letter, which may or may not have gone to the Pope. So let's forget Bishop Darcy altogether and all the nasty imputations that Teddy gives to him. Let's just look at what the Pope said.
Okay, so let me just jump in real quick. This is just a note for myself. Bishop Darcy, is he the one who said that the shroud was a fake?
Yeah, in about 1390-ish.
Okay,
but let's pretend he didn't exist. The year afterwards, this man who didn't exist and didn't write anything, the Pope sends a letter to the priory, it was a priory, the church at Lire, saying that the shroud must not be, it wasn't being proclaimed as the shroud, but it mustn't be exhibited as a genuine shroud. They weren't allowed to use any extra candles in the church other than what was necessary to see your way around. They weren't allowed to bring any people into the church, any clerics into the church, other than was necessary for crowd management, basically. They weren't allowed to have any singing or any incense or any prayers. And there had to be someone who, when the doors were open, announced in a great loud voice, "This is not the shroud, it's a representation of the shroud." Now, it may be that Bishop Darcy had nothing whatever to do with that, in which case the authenticists, and maybe Teddy would like to come in on this, will have to explain why the Pope should suddenly come up with this very, very strongly worded announcement that the shroud could not be taken as authentic.
I think that the reason... Oh, I'm sorry. Was somebody talking?
No, it was just me saying. I think that sums up my response to your point.
Okay. Yes. So I think that there's a clear motivation on the Pope for doing that, because when the Pope was related to the Descharnes, and I think that with Darcy stirring up all this fuss, Darcy's basically trying to strong-arm the Pope into getting them to stop displaying the shroud, because it was diverting tourists to their church, which Darcy, that wasn't like part of his jurisdiction where he was, they were getting money. I'm not clear on the details of that, but Darcy had an axe to grind. The roof collapsed at the church and messed up their stained glass windows, and that costs a lot of money. And he's wanting people filling his collection plates as opposed to the ones over in Leary at the church there. And so I think, knowing that he knew that the Pope was related to the Descharnes, that it opened up the Pope to looking like he's engaged in nepotism, letting his relatives display this. And so it's kind of like if you're at a competition and somebody's parent is the judge. The kid whose parent is the judge is either going to have it easy or is going to have it much harder. And so I think the Pope, being related to them, he wanted to not give off the appearance of impropriety. And so as a result, told them, hey, quit it, knock it off. I think that could be the reason.
Yep. So you're now saying that not only did the Holy Bishop of Troyes think that the shroud was a fake, but so did the Pope think the shroud was a fake. And in fact, so did Descharnes say the shroud was a fake. Everybody said the shroud was a fake.
Well, no, wait a minute. I didn't say that the Pope was thinking the shroud's a fake. I'm saying that the Pope's trying to avoid the appearance of nepotism.
So you think that when the Pope says, you must announce in a loud voice in front of the crowd, this is not the shroud, you're thinking that the Pope was actually thinking, but it probably is.
I think the Pope was trying to cover his rear end so he didn't look bad.
I think I'm a good Catholic, and I can see you're clearly not. But I think it's a dreadful thing to say about
I'm not a Catholic. Well, I mean, the Pope sees what goes on in the Catholic Church with hiding stuff. So, I'm not going to make excuses for people. And I think there are plenty of good popes. And I'm not trying to be anti-Catholic or something, but I'm just not going to be an apologist for people when I think that there are other things going on.
Okay, but here we have three people, none of whom say that the shroud is authentic. So what on earth makes you think that the shroud is?
Well, first of all, the Pope didn't say that the shroud wasn't inauthentic. He was telling them to stop saying that it was inauthentic. There is a big difference. And I think that he was doing that for personal motivations, that he did not want to look like he was being partial to a relative. if a judge were to be in that situation, the judge would need to recuse himself. And I don't see the Pope wanting to recuse himself. Do you?
I don't think he needs to. I don't think he thought the Shroud was authentic. I don't think Darcy thought the Shroud was authentic. I don't think Geoffrey Desharnais II thought the Shroud was authentic. I don't think.
What basis do you have to think that Desharnais didn't think so? Why would you think that Desharnais didn't think so?
Because when he held his exhibition, what really irritated the bishop was not that he said the Shroud was authentic, but that he put it out that it was only a representation, but had all the panoply of authenticism surrounding it, so that the people who came to visit it thought that it was authentic. You've got to read the Darcy letter very carefully. What really puts him in a rage is that Desharnais is not saying that the Shroud is authentic. He's saying that it's a representation, but putting all the panoply around so that it appears to be authentic.
Maybe he's trying to cover himself because he obviously wasn't there when the Shroud was created.
Yeah.
In terms of naturally.
I think
unless you know with 100% certainty the provenance of something, you might want to kind of hedge your bets a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, all this is remotely possible, but one of the points about David inviting us on the show was to look at reasonableness.
Yes.
Here we have three people, all of whom say the Shroud is not authentic. And authenticists all have to say, oh, yeah, but none of them believed it. There's absolutely no evidence that the Shroud was authentic. There's no evidence that any of them thought the Shroud was authentic. So authenticists have got to sort of make up possible motives why these three authoritative people should all pretend that it wasn't. And that seems to me less reasonable than thinking that they all said it was not authentic. They all thought it was not authentic. That's
this
sensible way of looking at it.
Well, this authenticist doesn't give a hoot what other people say. This authenticist takes, in terms of people just making statements, this authenticist cares about what the evidence is. Okay. And that's, what we're about to get into. So, who cares what Darcy said and the Pope and all of them? Let's look at the details of this cloth.
I'd like to move on to that, but let's just say that those three statements from those three people in 1390 tend towards the most reasonable interpretation is that they all thought the Shroud was a fake. Or the prima facie interpretation is that they all knew that the Shroud was a fake. The Shroud is not described as the real Shroud until about 100 years later, until about 1450.
People write all sorts of things to cover their rear ends.
Yeah, so, they might all be lying. But on the other hand, they might not be.
Well,
and you know to suggest that they are.
Well, if we're gonna go with that, then let's just look at
what we're about.
Bible. And no, I know that you're a Catholic, so I don't think I'm having to convince you of anything. But if that is the standard that people listening to this are going to go by, well, then look at the Bible with all of the different attestations as to seeing the risen Christ. So, if you're going to take things just like that, then. But anyway, back to the Shroud. So, are you ready to get into the details on that, Hugh?
Move on to another bit.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Yeah, move on. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. So, we have this cloth, and there was a team of Americans that formed a group called the Shroud of Turin Research Project, and they were fascinated by the Shroud and trying to figure out, whether or not this was a painting. That was actually what they suspected, that it was a painting, and so they were trying to figure out whether that was really the case or not. But aside from the history of that, but this team, the STURP team, when they went and investigated and did research and had access to the shroud, which was at that time, of course, not in the hands of the Catholic Church yet. It was still part of the House of Savoy's under their control, and they're the ones that gave the Sturp team access to do all sorts of tests on the shroud. But when the Sturp team did their analysis, and they ended up putting out a paper that people can read, and I'm sure probably Hugh, you and I are probably going to attach a bunch of things, or at least I should probably just speak for myself. I'll attach things for people to read. But some of the important things and findings that the Sturp team found is that the shroud, the image on the shroud, and again, we have the body image, which is like a straw color, like a straw yellow color, and then we have the bloodstain images, which are a red color. But what they found was that there was no paint that could account for these images. There was no pigment on the cloth that could account for these images, no dye or stain that could account for these images. And so then the first question is, what in the world is making up this image? Now, one of the scientists, that he was not an official member of Sturp, but he was still kind of working on the shroud and investigating it. His name was Dr. Walter McCrone, and he was a microscopist. Am I pronouncing that correctly, Hugh?
Yeah.
Okay. So he ended up, let me back up. When they were having access to the shroud, the scientists, the Sturp team, they were able to pull up fibers and threads and all sorts of particles off of the shroud, and they put it onto this special type of mylar tape that was especially made. Dr. Ray Rogers had it specially made for them, so that the adhesive that was on that tape would be soluble in toluene and also xylene, so that when they would press that tape onto the shroud and lift it up, they could then flush with the toluene solution, the adhesive, yet still leave intact the fibers and the particles that were being lifted off of the shroud, and so that they can analyze these particles and fibers. And of course, before they did any type of chemical analysis on these things, they first looked at it very closely through a microscope to learn what they could from that before subjecting it to the chemical testing. But again, so with all of this testing, they didn't find paint, pigment, dye, or stain. What they were finding, however, is that the red images were blood. Now, at first, they thought that it was primate blood. You will see in some shroud literature where they say human blood, and I don't think that that's at least not for the most part, purposeful. I think sometimes people just misunderstood. And then once one person writing about the Shroud wrote human blood, then a lot of people tend to just cite to that or refer to that, to where they have mislearned something. And, we see this on the internet all of the time. Somebody gets bad information, then it spreads like wildfire, and then people are, just in the wrong about some information they have. But so at first, they thought that it was indeed primate blood, and that was as far as the Stirp team went with it. But since science has come a long way, and now they're understanding things like cross-reactivity between different species, now they're starting to realize, we can't be certain that it's even primate blood. So we do know that it's blood because they see porphyrins, hemoglobin, all sort. They did to test the bloodstain images. They did 12 different types of examinations, checking through X-ray fluorescence, the reflection spectra, microspectrophotometric transmission spectra, the hemochromogen tests, tons of stuff, bile pigments, protein, albumin, protease tests, and some additional ones. They did a bunch of tests. They didn't just look at it and say, "Oh, yeah, it's blood." No, they. Dr. Adler, who Heller and Adler were the people doing those chemical tests and on the blood, and Dr. Alan Adler was a blood specialist, especially with porphyrins, and they said for sure it's blood. Dr. Kelly Kearse, who writes. Has written a number of scholarly articles on the blood evidence, and he's a specialist.
Allow me to just interject real quick. Hugh, do you agree that it's blood? Do you stipulate that?
I've always thought it was blood ever since Pierluigi Bologna, the Italian, who didn't just look at teeny weeny little dots and fibers, who ripped out great chunks of the shroud with his scissors and tweezers, which the Americans largely tend to forget about. So he had great lumps of blood to look at. And he was the one who identified it as group AB, and he was in fact, nothing that the Stirp team did could possibly have identified anything that they found as of a particular kind of blood or of a particular blood type, a particular species of blood. So this is all the Italian discoveries. And I go along with Kelly that it's not scientifically provable that the blood is not from an orangutan or a gibbon. But on the other hand, if I was a medieval person responding to the blood cults that were particularly popular at the time, and I wanted to put some blood onto a fake relic, I would have simply gone down the road to the nearest barber, who were the surgeons of the time, and popped in while he was doing some bloodletting, which was the single commonest surgical procedure of the time. So there was buckets of human blood readily available. Why go off and see if you try and find a chimpanzee? So I think it was human blood.
Okay. So since we can stipulate, at least between the two combatants, that it was blood, possibly human blood, I think that we can move on to the next point. But I haven't heard from Darren. So Darren, I think I recall you disputing or challenging the idea of the blood, or that whether it was blood or whether it was human blood. Did you have anything to add to that?
No, for me, it's never been for me, it's never been about the details of the shroud. It's always been about the structure of the arguments behind the shroud. So we can grant that it's blood, but just because it's blood doesn't mean it's not a forgery, and then if you want to claim that the blood got on there by supernatural means, then you have to demonstrate the supernatural causation. So, that's just my thing.
We can grant that it's blood. We can grant that it's possibly human blood. We can't prove that it's human blood, but it's possibly human blood. So what would be the next step in the process then?
Can I respond to Teddy's description of the Stirp investigations so far?
Sure.
Yeah, because she went into. You've got a list in front of you, haven't you, Teddy? Reading out all this spectroscopic.
Well, I'm not going to remember all of that stuff off the top of my head, right?
The spectroscopic investigations were first done by actually applying their spectroscopic machine to the actual shroud while they were in Turin.
Mm-hmm.
They were not applied to all the tiny little fibers that they brought back. Now, when they later, much later on, in fact, not probably in the 21st century, had a go at some of the shroud fibers, the spectrum that they got from the fibers was completely different from the spectrum that they got in Turin. So naturally, because it was 20 years later, they said that the one that was in Turin was all wrong. And this is one of the things I find a bit irritating about the Shroud papers, is that whenever they disagree with each other, then the one that's the sort of the minority view is always chucked out as being not very, very important, or the instruments weren't good enough to read it and stuff like that.
Where it was not with the minority view, are you talking about Macron or someone else's?
I'm talking about the individual, the Shroud scientists squabbling with each other. So, for example, the London and Morris spectrograph, which was trying to identify the quantities of iron oxide found on the shroud, they took a row of little dots, starting with the nose and going out from the nose outwards past the line of the hair until they got to a blank bit of shroud on the other side. And I think they took eight readings. So it's probably one every, I'm sort of holding up my finger, about one reading every half inch.
Mm-hmm.
And they got a level, an estimated quantity of iron oxide. And those readings correspond exactly to the intensity of the image at that point. So, for example, there's a lot of blood on the nose, and there's a lot of iron oxide on the nose. A lot of image, I should say, not blood, on the nose, and there's a lot of iron oxide on the nose. And there was a lot of blood on the hair, and there's a lot of iron oxide on the hair. And just inside the hair, as you head towards the nose, as it were, there's a very dark bit where there's hardly any image at all. Sure enough, there was no blood on that particular bit. No iron oxide on that particular bit. And then the iron oxide was a sort of medium value as you go across the cheek. So there was an almost exact correspondence between iron oxide and image along that line of measurement. Well, that is usually discarded as being, the instrumental inaccuracy. They couldn't possibly have got it right. When they did more experiments down by the feet, it was much less obvious. And so obviously, it'd be much better to assume that the whole thing was worthless. And I think this is quite typical of how we deal with people we don't like, or with ideas that our friends come up with, but we disagree with. We say, sorry, your instruments weren't good enough. So the people who did spectral tests to try and find out what elements there were in the blood failed to find any potassium at all.
Well, there wouldn't be, because the body was dead and the potassium starts decreasing.
No, blood's full of potassium. But the point was...
Not according to Adrie van der Hoeven, there's a complete reason why there's no potassium.
Yeah, I've got a feeling she says something really bizarre about the potassium sticking to the cell walls of the hemoglobin, of the red blood cell, and the hemolysis makes it all ooze out, leaving the blood cells behind.
I can find it. I've got her whole explanation.
Keen on. Anyway, the point is not whether there's potassium there or not, because in fact the Italians, hey, bless their cotton sock, found lots of potassium. The point was that as soon as somebody from Stirp said, we can't find any potassium, the response was, oh, that's because your instruments weren't good enough. So as soon as we find an argument that possibly has some faintly contradictory evidence against authenticity. There's a great sort of gang fight from the people who are the authenticists who go, it doesn't really matter, you got it wrong. My favorite one is that dear fellow, Robert Villarreal, sounds Italian, but I think Villarreal probably his name was, who looked at one of Ray Rogers' threads, and this was a whole thread that he'd managed to get hold of, goodness knows where from, but she thought was spliced together, and everyone went, this is terrific. He's going to prove that one end is linen and one end is cotton, and we're going to prove the reweaving theory. And yet Villarreal said, no, both ends were cotton, which, of course, completely destroyed the point. Why would anybody want to reweave some cotton into some other cotton? So what did the good people of Stirp say about that? His instruments were all wrong, and he couldn't really tell the difference.
Well, there has been the issue of whether when the linen fiber was spun, if there were some traces of cotton that were on the
yep. Villarreal, all of his bits were all cotton. He wouldn't have any linen in it at all. So immediately he was disregarded by the rest of his friends.
Who said that everything was cotton?
Roberto Villarreal.
And who was he?
He was the person to whom I think Ray Rogers probably sent a little bit of thread that he had that was joined. I think it was only something like 10 millimeters long, but the middle of it had a blob of some orangey brown glue in it, which I think he identified as some kind of gum. Mm-hmm. And Villarreal sent it off to one of his lab team to look at, and it came apart as he was mounting it for inspection under the microscope. You remember?
Well, I know that Adrie Vanderhoven talks about how she does not believe in the invisible reweaving theory because she, trying to remember the details, but she had reason as to why she was saying that there was cotton throughout, just traces.
Probably. Yeah. Can I get back to the stuff? So we take these sticky tape things, okay, and they're about, what should we say, a centimetre and a bit wide, and they're about 4 centimetres, 5 centimetres long. Mm-hmm. And they are taken by Ray Rogers, who had not only had his special tape specially made, but he also had his special application machine specially made, and he specially took all these things, and then he mounted them specially again in a glass box, and you can see pictures of the glass box with them mounted so that they're stuck on the two sides, but the sticky side is downwards facing the box anyway. So he's got all these wonderful specimens, and what does he do with them? The first thing he does, he gets them home to America, and he immediately sends almost all of them away. Why do you think he does that?
To Macron, of all people.
Why does he do that?
He held on to some himself, and then he gave some to Macron.
Yeah.
And the problem was Macron, and this kind of gets back to the iron.
Why did he send them to Macron?
Well, because Macron is a famous microscopist.
What about Heller, who was a microbiologist? Why not give them to Heller?
Because they're wanting to closely inspect it, and so you would give it, I would imagine, to somebody who's known for looking at things under a microscope.
Yeah, the whole team knew that by far the most qualified person in the world to look at these tapes was Walter Macron. So they sent all the tapes to Walter Macron. Now, what did he do? He cut them all in half. All of them in half. So he was looking at maybe a 2 centimetre by 1.5 centimetre rectangle. Mm-hmm. What he did with his 32 half tapes, what was the first thing he did?
I think he sent them back.
No, he sent half of them back, but which Ray Rogers then kept and didn't give to either Adler or Adler. But what did Macron do with his half?
Well, I would imagine he inspected them.
He took photographs of them. Okay. And what did he do with those photographs?
Well, I don't know, but a photograph isn't...
Published them. They're all in his book, and they're all in his papers, and they're all in his peer-reviewed paper in the accounts of chemical research.
Well, most of the papers Macron has put out are in the publication that he owns and edits.
Well, yeah, but you can say that of almost any publication, can't you?
No, I don't think
Guess who? Well, who founded and edited Thermochemica Acta?
Yeah, okay, that's Ray Rogers. But what about all of the other STIRP members who had their papers put in journals that were peer-reviewed?
So I've always wondered, I don't know whether this is anything to do with it, but it would be interesting to know, except that unfortunately I think they're both dead now. Why would you want to publish some microscopical studies which you did in Los Alamos, where are we? Is it Arizona, places like that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But why are they published in the Canadian Society of Forensic Scientists journal?
I mean, I don't know.
No, me neither. But it's odd, isn't it? Couldn't they get a proper forensic scientist journal, an American?
Maybe it's to not open themselves up to the Americans are going to be sticking up for the Americans. Maybe it's so it can look less biased.
Well, it's a possibility, isn't it? Anyway, it's interesting. The point is, not all Macron photos, but a number of Macron's photos are readily available on the internet to anybody who wants. They're published in his papers. He wrote 2 papers for his own journal, and he wrote 1 paper summing them up for the Accounts of Chemical Research, which is a very highly respected peer-reviewed journal. And of course, he published lots of them in his book, Judgment Day for the Turin Shroud. And anybody at all can look at those pictures and say, gosh, look, it's covered in red dots. Now, you cannot say they don't exist. They are there. Now, either he put them there himself and cheated, or something like that. But it's
STIRP never denied that there were random pieces of iron oxide on there. And that was from the 52 documented paintings that had been sanctified by being pressed up against the authentic shroud. Yep. And then you've got Isabel Picchek, an artist who did an experiment herself to see how much would flake, and vermilion, that color which Macron says is accounting for the red color, that is one of the worst at flaking off. But back to Macron, something that you had said earlier, this brilliant microscopist, people can be beyond brilliant, yet make really serious errors. And sometimes it's the kind of most silly errors that these people are prone to falling for. They just don't even think about it. Yeah. And apparently that's what happened to Macron.
When you say apparently, it's not apparent to me. Is it apparent to you?
Well,
it is obvious. It is apparent to you that Macron obstinately stuck to his explanation for his red dots, even when somebody perfectly reasonable came up with a different explanation. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I do. I do think once he dug his heels in the sand, he didn't want to unstick them.
Right. Do you know why he dug his heels in the sand?
Pardon?
Do you know why he was tempted to dig his heels into the sand? Have you read Heller's book, whatever it's called, Inquiry into the Shroud or something like that?
No, I haven't read the book.
Oh, it's brilliant reading. It reads like a novel, and it's not entirely invented, but it's quite chatty. But it makes it quite clear that at the very first conference after the return from Turin, when all the scientists gathered around to say what they'd found so far, Heller and Adler hadn't found anything at all, because they hadn't had anything at all to look at. I think Macron had sent them 3 slides. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so Macron turns up and he says, I've spotted iron oxide, and he shows them all these pictures. And immediately everybody goes, he's wrong. They had absolutely no evidence for that. They just decided he must be wrong from the start, because their other evidence had led them to believe that the shroud was authentic. That was one of the worst things that they did. And that was... that made Macron realize that he was flogging a dead horse as far as his colleagues.
Let's get into the details of this. First of all, Macron, the error that Macron made was when he was analyzing the iron oxide and all of the other things that he was analyzing, he never bothered to remove the items from the sticky tape. He just slapped the sticky tape onto the glass and looked at it through the glass, and then that ended up, as Adler and others have said, it changed the the reflection
refractive index.
The refractive index on it, and so he said no, it can't be blood because of the refractive index wasn't right, and so but Adler did it right. He ended up removing the particles from the sticky tape and analyzing it straight. Plus, Macron never, ever analyzed the whole. He was never there looking at the actual shroud and having his nose a centimeter away from it. He only had those sticky tapes that he didn't analyze properly by not removing it from the tape, and so that threw off the refractive index. And he never. There's a fantastic debate between. If somebody wants to hear some really good stuff, a debate between Dr. Gilbert Lavoie and Walter Macron, and Macron just does not have an answer for the criticism that he never bothered to remove the particles from the sticky tape, and that threw off what the refractive index was. And he kept trying to stick to, it's vermilion that's accounting for the blood. Well, you know what? Vermilion does not have hemoglobin in it, and porphyrins and all of the other things that make blood very distinct from a paint pigment. I mean, vermilion has, mercury sulfide, I think.
Yeah.
And that's got the opacity of lead. And so when they did these scans on the shroud, if all of those blood marks were made from such an opaque material, they would have been able to have spotted tons of vermilion. But the vermilion that they spotted on the shroud, which, yes, it did exist, Stirp acknowledged that it existed. But that vermilion was flaked off from one of the 52 documented paintings that were touched to the shroud. And artist Isabelle Pixet, who was a prodigy, at age 14, she had applied to this, submitted painting for a contest to something like do a mural or something in like a Vatican library, something really big like that. And she's a little 14-year-old pipsqueak, and they picked her. And she does they refer to her as having been a monumental artist because she does these murals and drawings that are, I think, 70 feet tall. And so she is an expert among experts. But, she was extremely critical of Macron, because Macron, he just kept hammering, this is a painting. It's like, where is the paint? And he kept saying, it was just a thin watercolor of diluted iron oxide and for the body image, and then it was vermilion for the blood. Well, then how come on the scans are we not seeing proof of all of this vermilion everywhere? Why do we have elements of blood where the blood image is? And then he was saying Macron's theory is that for the medium, that it was like animal proteins, and that was sort of the binder. And all of these things, the binder that he was talking about is water soluble. Well, when the fire of 1532 happened, and the shroud had to get doused. Well, I mean, it wasn't the whole thing, but parts of it got hit with water. If it was a water-soluble image, the image should have been destroyed. Now, Walter McCrone tries to say, oh, well, like in parts of the abdomen, chest area on the Shroud image, you see where it looks like these watermarks and stuff. Well, Dr. Gilbert Lavoie pointed out these are calcium rings. These aren't what, that the image was destroyed. And Dr. Gilbert Lavoie made the point of saying, if you look microscopically at those calcium rings, guess what you see underneath? The image, undisturbed, because the image was not paint, as Dr. McCrone. So McCrone, I mean, I'm not trying to take away that this man was great at what he did, but sometimes great men can make errors of monumental proportion. And because of his just constantly hammering that paint theory, you've got a whole bunch of people out there that just kind of cling to the mantra of, oh, it's just a painting. It's a painting. It's not a painting. And we'll get into the details of that.
Let me dive in right there as we have rounded our 1 hour mark. The conversation is heating up, which it should. But I just wanted to know at this point if we can find a little bit of agreement before moving on the next point. Hugh, would you be willing to stipulate that there are some things the image can't be? So obviously, Teddi believes that the image is the blood of Jesus Christ. So I know that you don't agree with that, but then again, you also would agree that it can't be Plato. So,
right.
So what are some things that you can stipulate that it can't be, and that way we don't have to go over the things that you both agree with?
Okay. Well, I'm happy to. Well, first of all, make a definite distinction between the image and the blood. The blood probably is blood. I'm thinking it's quite likely that it is at least enhanced. I don't know what the proportion would be. Giulio Fanti also says he's found vermilion in blood stains, which is different, of course, from the stuff that McCrone found. And he thinks that the blood might have been touched up later. Either way, the blood is a bright pink at the moment. It's quite an extraordinarily bright pink, and it's not possible that any blood degradation product could result in that colour. So I'm happy to agree that the blood is blood, but I think it must have some other thing in it to make it pink. The image, on the other hand, is not pink. The image is brown. And
it's straw yellow is how they term it.
It's certainly not pink. Now, I'm fairly sure that particulate matter of some kind makes up a component of it. But again, I'm not sure that that's the most important component. I think the colour on the fibres themselves is probably the most important bit. Now, McCrone tested the linen fibres with a reagent to see if he could detect protein. And he found little blobs of protein on it, dotted about. But it wasn't, to my mind, the blobs of protein wouldn't be enough to account for the degradation of the fibres. So I've been working on for years now some sort of acid degradation of the fibers, and reading the books of instructions by various medieval artists who came up with these books of instructions, like Cernini, for example, and they come up with various recipes to try and get your paint to stick onto the cloth. And I may say that the medieval people were quite good at making paint stick to cloth in such a way that you didn't wash it off. Otherwise, they couldn't have had painted flags in the rain and things like that. But and they did paint flags, and they did use them in the rain, and they didn't wash off. So what we're needing to look at is some kind of medium which perhaps could crack off, or just maybe the whole shroud was washed, as far as I can see, but leaving the image behind. And that, I'm quite happy to work at the moment. I've been working for ages and still happy to work with the fact that the image is really made of the, what do they call it? Oxidized, dehydrated, conjugated, whatever it is, surface of the cells, of the flax cells. Now, one of the things that the Stirp team were spectacularly bad at, and I think I can slightly blame Heller here, because he was the person who should have known better, and that is none of them had any idea of the microscopy of plant cells. We hear from the start, everyone talks about the tube down the middle of a flax cell as being a medulla. And this is an absolute giveaway. A medulla is the tube down the middle of a piece of wool, an animal cell. The thing down the middle of a flax cell is a lumen. Now, the thing is, you might go, hey, it doesn't matter, they got one thing right, one thing wrong. If they had been biologists of any kind, they would never have described the hole down the middle of a flax cell as a medulla. It can only be described as a lumen. So it just goes to suggest to me that they didn't really know what they were talking about. Now, let's consider our flax cell. So we've got a hole down the middle, which is, of course, made of nothing. It's a hole. And then wrapped around the outside of that, we've got the cell wall. And this is divided into two. The secondary cell wall, which is almost entirely made of cellulose and is quite difficult to degrade using acids and things like that. And then the primary cell wall, which is around the outside of it, and that's the one that's famously, whatever it is, 200 nanometers thick or something like that. And that's largely made of Hemi Cellulose with a bit of pectin thrown in. That's the one that's much easier to degrade. So that's what I've been trying to degrade myself, using stuff like vinegar and lemon juice and things like that. Unsuccessfully, I may say, at the moment. Anyway, no, carry on.
Well, I was going to say, regarding the Hemi Cellulose, yes, I've read too that it is much easier to degrade than traditional cellulose. The problem with it is that the shroud doesn't look like it's easy to degrade. It's actually remarkably in phenomenal condition, especially if you think that it was around, from the first century. But I've got some things to respond in general. You mentioned the blood, that you think that the blood might be enhanced. Well, I would say that, you're certainly free to think that, but there's no evidence for that. Yes. That has been examined, and we have no evidence.
Yes, we have.
What's the evidence for that?
We have both Macron's vermilion. We have a certain amount of vermilion, a tiny bit of vermilion found by the Stirp team, and we have Giulio Fanti's vermilion. We've got three completely independent groups of people studying the shroud. All three of them have found vermilion on the bloodstains. Well, now, it's all very well, and so it's there. Now, it's all very well saying, yes, well, this may be due to people lying paintings on top of the shroud and the paint flaking off the paintings and that sort of thing. But that's the thing that you've got no evidence for.
Sure I do. We don't deny, Stirp never denied that vermilion was found.
No, but they made up a reason for the vermilion being there, which has never been justified.
Well, wait, the reason for the vermilion being there is because somebody who had the fake shrouds that were being sanctified used vermilion and it flaked off.
That's what you say.
There's no evidence
for that at all.
Well, yeah, it's 52 paintings that have been documented that have touched the shroud, and
there's no evidence that those 52 paintings have been laid paint side down onto the shroud in such a way that the vermilion on the paintings exactly matched the bloodstains on the shroud. That's just made up.
Well, nobody's saying that. I'm certainly not saying that the shroud's bloodstains are made of vermilion. They're blood. I mean, where else are you getting all of the other components for blood in vermilion? Because vermilion is obviously chemically extremely distinct.
You're twisting my words. I said that the bloodstains are made of blood. I said that they've got vermilion in them, which touch them up, which is why they're pink. And what I'm saying, that vermilion there's no evidence whatever that vermilion came from these other 52 shrouds, which are alleged to have been laid face downwards onto the actual shroud, for which there is no evidence whatever.
Well, I think Isabel Pickcheck was saying that it was face down. Now, I don't know what
yeah, but because she was Isabel Pickcheck was a stained glass window and mural maker. She knew nothing about the history of art. And
she knew nothing. I didn't think that she'd be.
She wasn't even an anatomist. Most all her drawings and paintings are fabulous, and they're huge, but they're not anatomically precise, and they weren't intended to be.
No, they're not. And that gets us to later on into some discussions in terms of anatomical accuracy. But back to the pink. So in terms of explaining the pink color, because that's something that has made everybody wonder, because naturally old blood ends up looking either a very dark brown to a black color. And back to Adrie van der Hoeven, I think she is the one who has come up with why it is, and it just puts everything together, why it is that the blood has maintained its pinkish red color. And she was saying, and there's evidence for it, that the shroud, during the manufacturing process, there was yellow matter dye put on it, which, among other things, acts as a preservative. And that's probably one of the reasons why the shroud is still so flexible and in excellent condition, given its age. But this yellow matter dye. Now let's go back to where I said in the beginning, no paint, no pigment, no dye, and no stain can account for the body image or the bloodstain images. But that yellow matter dye, guess what it is soluble in? Toluene, or if I'm pronouncing that, toluene, the chemical that Adler was using to rinse off the adhesive from that Mylar sticky tape.
Yes, so correct. Brilliant, yes.
And so, and this also accounts for why I think it's the Reyes sample, and because the sample that was radiocarbon tested, that had yellow matter dye on it. And people were saying, well, wait a minute, how come we've got this difference? It's because the toluene stripped off the yellow matter dye that was just a super thin layer, part of the manufacturing process. But that yellow matter dye did not account for the image. That was the background. And that might very well be why the shroud is sort of that straw yellow color. It may be that a little bit of that yellow matter dye is doing. So, maybe Ray Rogers with his the Maillard reaction, because they talk about, well, that's brown, but the shroud is straw yellow. Maybe that accounts a little bit for the differences. I don't know that it explains all of the properties.
I think. Can I say how you're being marvelous? And do you know why
I'm not Adrie van der Hoeven is.
No. It's you who are being so wonderful, because what you are doing is you are being both sides of the Stirp team together. So you began your statement, Malud, by saying that the Stirp team definitely found that there were no pigments, paints, dyes, or stains. And you are now saying, because you want to pick up Adrie van der Hoeven, that they were actually wrong when they said there are no stains and dyes, because they'd washed them all off with the toluene. So that statement you now agree is incorrect, and they're wrong.
No.
Oh, no,
I
Dr.
said
Shroud.
that can account for the body image and the bloodstain images. So there's a difference whether there is an even...
But wait a minute, there are lots of dyes that wash off with toluene. Yellow madder's not the only one. Red madder's another one. Any of the alizarine dyes, or for all I know, lots of other ones. I must pour my shirt and see if it goes bleached.
I don't know. I mean, I would say, though...
Both ways. Do you see? Or perhaps my moderators can say, you can't say on one hand that the Stirp team were correct in saying there are no dyes on the Shroud, and then on the other hand say, but don't worry, all the dyes could have washed off. You're saying two things which are directly contradictory, and what's more, which I think is just wonderful, you believe both of them.
No, because first of all, when they were stripping the blood off of the fibers...
They never stripped any blood off the fibers.
Sure they did. When they were examining the fibers with the blood,
yeah,
they found that underneath it wasn't yellow, the color of the image. It was the background color, which was whitish. And of course, that's why they the mantra is blood first in terms of how the Shroud was made, that you had the blood first, image second. Yeah. Because where the blood is, and also where the serum halos are around the bloodstains, the serum, which of course doesn't come from vermilion, right? Vermilion doesn't seep out. Serum, does it? With all the properties?
Or lemon juice.
Yeah, it doesn't.
Yes.
Right?
Or lemon juice has exactly the same effect.
Are you saying that lemon juice is chemically identical to human serum albumin? I don't think so.
It has a very similar effect when you look at it. Have you read Kelly Kearse's paper?
Similar? Well, our DNA is similar to a chimp's, but it's sometimes that 1 or 2% difference that makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah, but there's nothing in the serum. The only reason we know the serum's there is because of its appearance. It's never been analyzed chemically.
So let me just pop in.
That's correct.
Let me just pop in one more time here, as our time is rapidly escaping us. I just want to say for the listener, it's wonderful to see all of the great preparation on both sides, and I hope to get much more of this in the future. But I want to see if I can't focus the conversation on just a couple of beginner questions, because I fear that we've gotten well into the advanced stages of some of this, and if you're anything like me, you might be having trouble keeping up. So let me see if I can bring us back to just a couple of questions that I think everyone can wrap their minds around. The first question, I think I would go to you, Teddi, about the image itself. So, how does the image of a person who was who had a cloth laid on them get into that cloth? I mean, is that a common thing? Do we have other burial shrouds with other images in it from that time that we can look at? I mean, is that or is this a one-off
Well, of course
thing?
not. That's why the Shroud of Turin is special. Because there are lots of people who have, lots of Jewish people, lots of Muslims who have been buried in burial cloths.
Have we never recovered those cloths?
Well, I'm sure I know that the Jews tend to sometimes then get the bones out and put them in an ossuary. So I would assume you've got to unwrap, take
right.
the
So why
the
are
cloth
there no
off.
images, no cloths with images prior? And how would you say?
Because there's only one Jesus.
Okay, so
it's resurrected.
right. So Jesus and his resurrection. Maybe you can be more specific about how the image was burned into the cloth.
Well, that's the $1 million question in terms of the mechanism of action. And there have been a number of hypotheses regarding it. But the thing is, a lot of people have been able to fake up stuff, with flour and oil and this and that, through the sun burning, making images. And the problem is that the Shroud of Turin has a lot of properties that are complicated. And it's hard for people to actually even replicate. Well, I'm not going to go as far as to say that it's impossible to replicate one. Maybe even replicate a second. Which I'm not so sure about. I'd love to see somebody that does.
I was reading something from 2009 where a person claimed to replicate the Shroud and its unusual properties, but I'm not really asking about replication. I'm asking, what do you think? Maybe I'm asking you to speculate. What created the image? When I had Barry Schwartz on to talk about this, he did not believe that the image was legitimate either. But he also didn't want to go into what his theory was about the image, and so I would like to at least hear a reasonable proposition, a story of how being resuscitated from the dead puts an image on the cloth. It's a pretty straightforward question, and I would love to get an answer.
It's a straightforward question, kind of like, well, how was the universe created? Yeah, it's an easy, straightforward question.
So you're just saying the image is a miracle. It's not through any kind of natural process at all.
As far as, if we're going to go where the evidence leads us, then the evidence thus far is that it was through some miraculous, I would imagine, in terms of, if I'm going to speculate, and this is what I think happened, but in terms of the details, it's like, who knows? I think that as part of bringing a dead body back to life, I think that there was some sort of force of energy.
Radiation?
That, I don't know that it's radiation. I think, because I know some people have their little radiation theories. I think that it's some sort of God-derived energy, probably something that we just have no familiarity with.
Okay, so theologically speaking, if there's
brought the life back to life,
right? So
the body back to life.
I'm just trying to cover as much as I can with what time remains. So theologically speaking, because that's always what I'm interested in. If this unnatural process happened and left this unnatural image on this strips, whatever, why is there no mention of an image in the Bible or in other literature around that time? Why, if this thing existed and they had it then, didn't they ask right there at the cross, what is this image?
Well, we don't know for a fact, obviously, whether or not the image was present ab initio, or if it took a little bit of time for it to develop. We don't know.
Might it have developed, say, a few hundred years later?
Who knows? Who knows? The only people would be the people that had custody of the Shroud.
Okay, so I'm gonna throw it over to Hugh, because I'm gonna ask you a similar question. Obviously, not the same question, since you don't believe the image is some kind of magic. But what do you think the image is? And I would like for you to comment on why doesn't history, biblical history, give us any mention of this image?
Yeah, I'd love to. The thing is, it's got a lot to do with reasonableness at this point. We've been discussing very precise points of technical science observation, which either it is or it isn't, and that sort of thing. But when it comes down to exactly how something is done and it's not been done before, whether it's a miracle or not, or we haven't got a demonstration of it, we have to go for what is reasonable. So this is my idea of what is reasonable. I'm going to start with the Easter Sepulcher. I'm sure I've explained this to somebody. The Easter Sepulcher, which was a feature of medieval churches and is still a feature of some churches, which was a wooden box in many cases, which on Good Friday in thousands of churches throughout the whole of Europe was placed in the north transept of churches. And in a lot of churches, a crucifix or a figure of Jesus was placed in that wooden box with a shroud wrapped around it. On Easter Sunday, a little play was enacted in which the priests or clergy would go out to the north transept. They would find another member of the clergy dressed as an angel sitting on the box, and they would say that the angel clergyman would say, "Why are you here?" They would say, "We're looking for Jesus of Nazareth," and he would say, "He's not here. Here is his shroud. Take it and show the people." And the remaining priest went back to the altar and displayed this cloth to the people. Now, we have examples of the wooden box. We have examples of the figure of Jesus that was placed in the wooden box. What we don't have is any examples of the cloth that the figure was wrapped in. However, some of those figures are almost like bas reliefs. In other words, they're not a full and exact model of a dead body. They look more like a thick board, maybe, I'm just sort of holding my finger, 15 centimeters thick or something like that, carved across the front with the figure of the dead body of Jesus and carved on the back with the figure of the dead body of Jesus. So if you get a figure like that, of which there are some, and you spread the whole figure with some kind of stain-making colorant, and this is what I'm not sure of at the moment. I've just been carrying out lots of experiments with Marmite, funnily enough, but that hasn't worked. But I'm hopeful of using the Gala Shelley idea that a 1% mixture with 1% of acid in it of one kind or another might be the answer. Anyway, so you then spread the shroud onto this figure, and when you peel it off, you've got the sticky stuff all sticking to the shroud. Now that's pretty horrible, but you then wash the shroud completely, and the sticky stuff all comes off. But because of the content of the sticky stuff, it has degraded the cloth underneath. And I think that they put this figure down face up, laid the shroud on it, peeled it off, then put the figure down face down, laid the backside of the shroud on that, peeled that off, and then went and washed it. And that's how I think it was done. And all I need to do is to find what the chemical was that it was mixed with. And I'm going for wine at the moment, because in one of the medieval liturgical descriptions of what happened on Good Friday is they took their image down and they wash it in wine. And if you wash something in wine and then you don't then rinse all the wine off, presumably the wine goes all sticky and slightly acidic and vinegary. And if you then put something on that, with any luck, that'll make a mark on the shroud, and that's on the cloth. And that's what I'm going for at the moment. Now, can I go back to the theological bit now?
There's hang on, Teddy, though, because I was
asked two questions, and I want to come back on the second one.
Definitely,
and that is, if we've got absolutely no idea what actually happened because nobody saw it, and let's take the Gospels as gospel for the time being, then one way of saying what happens when a body comes back from the dead is to look at other examples. And of course, the New Testament has 5 other examples of people who came back from the dead. And not one of them is associated with one of these great bursts of energy or flashes of light or anything like that. What happens is they just get up. Life returns to them, and they get up and they walk home. And I don't see why Jesus needed any some particular flashy kind of getting up when all these other people could just get up and walk home.
Well, perhaps because he's God incarnate.
Does it matter?
I think it does.
Why does he need a flash of light when nobody else does? What's he need a flash of light for? He's God incarnate. What's the point of the flash of light?
Perhaps
nobody could see
that flash of light can put an imprint on a shroud so that when God put Jesus on this earth, so that the people during his time period could actually see God incarnate after he was resurrected.
Fantastically circular reasoning, if you ask.
No. It's listen. Here's
like, because it made an image on the shroud. That's what you're saying.
Well, okay. If God wanted, okay. So you said you're a Catholic.
Yeah.
So I would assume that you believe that Jesus was God incarnate, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So I would assume that you probably agree with me that when God put Jesus on this earth, that the whole purpose for him putting himself, I believe in the Trinity. I think you probably do too.
Yeah. Full of normal theology. Yeah.
Okay, so the whole point of putting Jesus on earth is so that people could interact with this Jesus, to see what he was like, to learn from him, to learn his philosophy, and to see his miracles, and to help make God be more relatable to humans, so that we could somehow grasp at least a portion of what God is. So obviously, when Jesus died and was resurrected, now he's no longer roaming the earth. But I think God left the shroud so that we still have, because we've got his, I believe, that's his face. And so, and I've seen these recreations where these artists, through computer models and all of that, has managed to recreate the face. But you know what? When you look at those first century catacombs, or that catacomb where there was that image of Jesus, that looks like the shroud. The Byzantine depictions of Jesus look like the shroud. Being Greek Orthodox, the icons that I've always grown up seeing, when I first saw the Shroud of Turin, that was a very familiar image to me. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I just don't think they do look anything like the shroud. The Pantocrator does not.
Be kidding me.
No, it's a man with a beard. Lots of people have got beards. But to say that it looks like the shroud has got a very particular and distinctive rectangular-looking face, whereas every single one of the Byzantine icons has a sort of like a tear-shaped face where they're pointed at the bottom and round at the top.
Yeah, I think that's in the eye of the ball.
Okay, if you like, I'm prepared to accept that, but I think it's entirely mythological.
I think people can just take a look for themselves and see the striking. It doesn't look like the anglicized version of Jesus with the blonde hair and. No,
it just doesn't have the right shape. It doesn't look anything like the shroud.
Yeah, the nose, the eyes.
They're almost clean shaven, except for a spindly little 2 wisps of moustache coming down the side of the mouth, and a delicate little beard. This sort of thing is nothing like the shroud at all. It's like the hairstyles of Byzantine people of the 3rd and 4th and 5th century.
Well, I'm sure you've seen the recreations of the face from the shroud.
Yeah.
And then you compare that to, I forgot the name of the catacomb. Was it St. Catherine's Catacomb, the 1st century one where there was that...
The big shaggy one, which has got Alpha and Omega on either side of it. It's got Jesus with lots of hair and lots of beard.
Well, that to me looks quite shroud-like, and that was that's a 1st century depiction in a catacomb where the Christians.
But yeah,
was it 3rd?
Well, yes. I mean, obviously, if you draw 1 million pictures, then sooner or later one of them has got look a bit more like the shroud than the others.
Yeah, but this one was like before there was influence.
But it's just a man with long hair and a beard. All sorts of people had long hair and beard. God.
They don't all look like the man on the shroud.
I don't think that man looks like the man on the shroud. I'm sorry. I mean, I'm perfectly prepared for other people to say that all men with beards look exactly the same. But we people who have beards, and David knows this very well, we can tell the difference between one beard and another. We know the difference between a moustache and another.
I'm not looking at the beard. I'm looking at the eyes. I'm looking at the nose. I'm not looking at the beard at all.
Anybody who draws two eyes and a nose, I mean, almost everybody, every single Byzantine painting, or mosaic especially, has got these massive great eyes, which everyone says is unique to the shroud. But in fact, it's true of every single apostle that's ever been produced on a Byzantine painting.
Of course, the mosaic, being what it is extremely imprecise, given that it's a mosaic. But back to your whole Easter cloth.
Yeah, if you like.
So the problems with this are, okay, let's just break it down.
There is one problem, but if you can find it, well done.
Oh, I can find a lot of problems with it. So somebody is going to just make this cloth for like an Easter ceremony.
Yes.
So let's get into, because if you are saying, which I think you are, that the Shroud of Turin is this Easter cloth, somebody back in medieval times went through a whole lot of trouble for just an Easter ceremony at a church, and they're so ingenious that nobody in this day and age, with all of our advanced technology and knowledge and all of that, can recreate it. And so now let's get down to the details in terms of, to get what we have on the Shroud of Turin, because somebody's going to, by the end of this, somebody is going to believing in a miracle, whether it's the miracle of the resurrection and that it left this imprint, or the miracle of some forger or artist being able to pull this off. Because let's get into what has to happen. So let's start off with just,
and before you do, I'm just gonna jump in here and say we'll start winding up at this point, and we will pick it up the next time. I know that some of the Shroud episodes before have gone into 3 and 4 hour.
Oh,
parts.
Come on now! You gotta
wait to see whether anybody's interested.
Right, but this
is the best part.
I understand. So I want you to knock it out of the park, and I just want to alert the people. Yes, we're rounding into the last sections here for both sides. So begin, make your best argument here, and also try to round off what you are. Won't you say as a kind of a closing thought for why you think it is so reasonable and or unreasonable to believe and or not believe?
David, we were just getting warmed up.
I understand.
Okay, so now I'm just going to have to do a
I'm English. No, I don't get wound up.
But we will be back.
Warmed up, yes. Not wound up.
Yes. But we will be back. I just want everyone to know this will not be the end, and they will not have said everything that they wanted to say. But we will explore more of this, hopefully, before too long. We can get into questions about the age of the Shroud, the dating, that sort of thing. I was hoping to make that the next time, but if we have to do more on the image, that's fine too. Teddy, go ahead.
All right. So
okay, let's have 4 things or 5 things, if you like, that the medieval creator of this liturgical cloth had to achieve.
We got a lot more than 4 or 5 things, but let's just start off with, first, why would they put, whether it's real bloodstains or not, why would they put bloodstains in the wrist area and not the palm area where it's traditionally seen in art? That would throw off all the parishioners thinking, well, who's the moron that put it in the wrist? Don't they know it's supposed to go in the palm? Right. Second of all, there is a cap of thorns. When you look at the blood stains on the head, and of course the shroud is a double image, a frontal and dorsal image, and we can see through all of the bloodstains around the head. Now, we don't unfortunately have the image at the top of the head, the very tip top, because the shroud didn't capture that image. But we can see that that given how many punctures there are, which are consistent with the crown of thorns, which of course, if you're doing an Easter cloth, would be representing. But they didn't do the traditional circlet like we normally see. They did a cap. That would be what the puncture marks depict. Then you've got on the actual shroud, there are depictions of pre-mortem wounds and bloodstains, as well as post-mortem. And you can tell by way of the way that the blood is flowing. And in artwork, you don't see any blood that is depicted the way blood is on the shroud, because the blood that's on the shroud isn't just liquid blood that's been brushed onto it. That would then get into the linen and flow across the threads of the linen. What the blood stains that we see on the shroud are actually transfers of blood clot exudates. And so there's the whole difficulty in even creating that. Nobody has been able, because you've got, just with the scourge marks alone, 60 to 100 plus of those. Try to get all of those with blood, with doing blood clots, whereas you're putting one and then putting the other, that you're not smearing them, which of course on the shroud, they're not smeared. The shroud shows the detail of both the blood flows. Some are arterial, some are venous, and they are all medically in the correct spots. Where the spear wound is, because that was a post-mortem wound, the blood wouldn't spray out. It just fell out, and the shroud perfectly depicts that medically, where you've got all of these forensic pathologists who've looked at that, and they are amazed at the medical accuracy that the blood flows operate in the way that they would expect them to, given how they see the wounds. I mean, you've got forensic pathologists who have basically done autopsies, with air quotes there, on the shroud, on a life-size shroud photograph, amazed at the details. Then you have, first of all, the weave of the cloth. This is from what the experts say, a 5th century or younger type weave. Is it possible for somebody during medieval times to get their hands on such a cloth? Sure, anything's possible. How probable is that? Highly improbable. There is natron, like what the Egyptians used to embalm their mummies. Bits of natron on there. Where's a medieval forger going to get that? You've got the side wound that matches a Roman lancea from the 1st century. That medieval forger or just some artist in medieval times knew about that. The image also is not just of a man laying down. The man is clearly in rigor mortis, and the shape of the man is of a man that is hanging off of a cross. And that's why when you look at, for example, the buttocks, they're not flattened like you would expect. So if you look at that dorsal image, the rear end is not flattened. It's fully shaped because it's off of the surface that he was on. And so for some artist to have created that, it would be hard enough to get their life-size model to stay, perfectly still as they paint the frontal image, but to do the dorsal image, the back image, the person would have to, the way that the shoulders are hunched over, the person would have to be like on one elbow and with their nose down on the ground in this weird contorted position. And then you've got the artist Isabel Picchek, who's, she was obviously quite acclaimed. And she was saying, she did an experiment, and she said that when you look at the Shroud image, in order for an artist to have created that image, they would have to be on a ladder about 15 to 20 feet high, looking down on the image. And even then, the artist would have to position themselves in such a special way in order to get a visual on a model, in order to get those perfect human proportions of the image that we see on the Shroud. Now, some people are going to say, oh, the arms are too long. The arms are not too long. What we see on the Shroud is foreshortening. And as Isabel Picchek talks about, normally, in order to use the technique of foreshortening, you need light, but the Shroud has no shading, no directionality in terms of a light source. And so then there's that challenge. Then you've got the fact that there are no brush strokes on the Shroud, that the closer you get to the Shroud, you can't even see what you're doing. You have to step 6 to 10 feet away from the Shroud in order to even see the image. So how would an artist have created that image up close? And you've got Michelangelo, who created David, and he gets the proportions wrong on that. So it's not so easy to create a life-size image that is so perfectly proportional that it would fool many forensic pathologists. Then you have the uniformity of the image that has to be accounted for, to where every thread, the color, that straw yellow color on the thread, on each pieces of thread, that color remains the same. We only see what appears to be shading because more pieces of the thread are kind of aggregated in order to give that appearance. But when you look at every piece of thread on the image area of that Shroud, they are all the same color. So when people try to do like a hot statue getting scorch marks, or or putting with the bas relief, putting pigment on that, you're not going to have total uniformity of color. It's going to be a stronger, color or pigment in one area than the other. Then you've got the superficiality of the body image, where that image, that, scorch-like mark that is on there, it only goes as deep as about 1 to 2 fibrils. And a fibril or fibril, when you have a piece of thread, linen thread, each piece of thread is composed of many fibers. Well, this image is so shallow, it can just be flaked off. And to do a lot of these other techniques with oil, flour, other things, that's going to seep into far more into just that surface area. And then you've got to have it be a body image where it's not going to fluoresce under UV light like a typical scorch mark does. Then you've got the serum albumin halos around all of these blood marks. Now, around some of the bigger blood wounds, it's easier to see those even without the aid of UV lit images. But for those scourge marks, what appear to be scourge marks, you don't really see those halos. So why would an artist put in that kind of detail, for an Easter play? And with, and again, you can't use liquid blood, because liquid blood would react very, very different on the linen. And Isabel Picek talks about how the shroud doesn't have an outline on it. And so how especially is an artist going to get all of these blood clot transfers in the proper place to mirror what the Gospels say, without first drawing an outline of the body so that then they can place the wounds? And then remember, it's not just creating one body that is properly proportionate. You've got to create two, the front and the back, on this super long cloth that has no primer. And Isabel Picek talks about how good luck painting something like that on unprimed linen, especially if it's watercolor, which is what Macron says that it is. And because watercolor isn't going to take very well to linen, and it's especially unprimed linen, and it's certainly not going to give you the superficiality that we have with the shroud image. So, I just there are a lot of very, very complex components that go into creating the image, the body and the blood image that we see. And like I said, you got to believe in a miracle one way or the other. The miracle of some artist that could pull that off with all of these features, because just pulling one or two features off, that's not the shroud. You've got to pull it all off. So either this piece of linen fabric is something miraculous one way or the other. So,
did I get a chance?
Yes, very well said, though. And Hugh, if you would give your statement and also round it off.
Yeah, I think Teddi made 27 statements. Okay, and what her brief was to start with, to say what is wrong with the idea that somebody smeared a statue and placed a cloth on top of it. Okay, so we can ignore 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of her statements are about blood. So I'm not going to go into that now. I'm just going to say if you just splish blood on the statue, the blood will transfer. So, but that has nothing to do with how the image was transferred, which was what Teddy's brief was. Okay, her next one was to announce that the weave must have been earlier than the 5th century. But that's nonsense. The weave must have been later than the 5th century, because it must have been produced on a 4-shaft treadle loom, which wasn't introduced to Britain and to Europe at all until about the 2nd century or so. So it has to be later, much later than 1st century Judea. Then she said that the shroud was covered in natron. Having decided that there were no pigment paint stains or dyes right at the beginning, we've now got the fact that covered in yellow madder, and it's also now covered in natron as well. That's very interesting. I don't think it's got any natron on it at all. Now, then we got a whole bunch which we can forget about, saying that how could an artist have painted it with brush strokes? He'd have to step back, and what's the other one that we've got? Something like that, which is all about what happens if the artist paints it. There's no outline. Of course there's no outline. If you smear a statue and you spread a sheet on it, you don't get an outline. So I think she was reading from a whole list of stuff that was mostly aimed at a different hypothesis from the one that I came up with. However, she did come up with some interesting ideas. She said, how would you use a person? Would you have to turn the person upside down and push his face into the ground? I wasn't suggesting using a person. I was suggesting using a wooden model. What else have we got? Now, she didn't seem to have any idea about what foreshortening was, and the fact that you need light to do foreshortening or something daft like that. Foreshortening, and I'm not sure that Isabel Picek got this right either. She didn't know what she was talking about. If you've seen that picture of her standing on the top of a ladder, looking at Ian Wilson, I think it is, underneath, and she is painting, or she's sort of imagining that she's painting him. Now, if he's lying absolutely flat, then take his thigh and the calves of his legs are a particular length. However, if he bends his knees and draws his feet a little bit closer up towards his buttocks, then from above looking down, his calves and his thighs are shorter than they are in real life. That is, in fact, not what we see on the Shroud at all. If anything, they're longer than what we see in real life. So foreshortening's got nothing to do with it. Right, one of the things that she says is the Shroud is a man in rigor mortis, and also mentions the non-flattening of the buttocks. This only applies if the painter used a dead body. If he just used a model, then the model can have legs and arms and heads wherever the carver put it. There's no evidence. If you ask, in fact, what is the evidence that the image on the Shroud shows a man in rigor mortis, you first of all have to assume that there was a dead man under the Shroud, which, of course, is circular reasoning again. If you actually say what evidence is there that the man is in rigor mortis, there is no evidence whatever, except by saying, well, if he was a real person, and if he was dead, and if he then made that sort of image, then he would have had to have contorted his body like this, so he would have had to have been in rigor mortis. But you've got to start with all those ifs before you get there, which I don't agree with. The superficiality is a good point. I think that was the only one that I thought was sensible. And that, of course, is what I'm working on at the moment, and it's not easy. I'll agree with her. So I started by just drenching a sort of bit of wooden former in a liquid and spreading the Shroud on it. And, of course, it as often as not, it does seep right through. So I think that the liquid, the stuff that was smeared on the image, which, as I suggest, might have been wine, well, if you let it dry and it becomes sticky, and then you smear a cloth on it, then the image doesn't come through, and you get that superficiality that's typical of the Shroud. So I think that's it. Now, I could now have I got time to have a quick look at all the blood things which were outside the original premise? Like, why are the nails through the palms of the hands? The Shroud does not show the palms of the hands. The Shroud shows the back of the hands. If you but if you find out decide anywhere you like where the hole is on the Shroud, draw an angle between the two knuckles of the Shroud's hand and the hole, and then measure that angle out on your own hand, and you'll be amazed to discover that the Shroud wound, the nail wound, is not in the wrists at all. It's actually in the part, it's in the middle of the hand.
I'm familiar with what Zugaby says, and I don't disagree with that. I agree.
You had quarter of an hour, and I've got 3 minutes.
Oh, sorry.
We've got the cap of thorns. There's no cap of thorns. You can't see the top of the head, so you can't tell there's a cap. It's definitely a ringlet. All the main Shroud wounds are in a line along the front half of the Shroud, and a line along the back of the back half of the Shroud. And the Bible specifically mentions how the crown of thorns was made, and then uses the word for the crown, which invariably refers to the kind of laurel crown that victors in battle or athletes were given at the end of the Olympic Games. What's more, all contemporary pictures of people wearing a crown, Herod the Great, Herod Antipas, Tiberius Caesar, and Augustus Caesar, these are all the people who wore crowns. And guess what? Not one of them is a cap. What else have we got? The idea that there's arterial and venous blood and pre-mortem and post-mortem blood. None of the arguments for that, I think, are at all strong. I'm not going to go into it now. But in fact, the idea that you can sort of somehow tell the difference between blood that's coming out of you just before you died and blood that's coming out of you just after you died doesn't make a great deal of sense. What else have I got here? The scourge marks. The scourge marks look to me as if they were dabbed on with something like a little piece of sponge with blood maybe dipped on the scourge marks. The idea that the blood, all of it, turns out doesn't flow at all. It's all from a blood clot exudation. Try looking up a blood clot exudation and see what that actually means. in medical terms. It's practically impossible to get a blood clot exudation. Once blood is dry, it's dry, and making it wet doesn't turn it into blood again. It just turns it into wet, dried blood. I think that's just about it. How could they possibly have got the blood in the right place? Well, if you've got a statue and you smear blood in the right place on the statue, then guess what? When you spread a sheet on it, the blood comes out in the right place. I think that's as quick whizzing through as I can do.
Okay, and so I am going to just put a pin in it right there.
No rebuttal?
No, we do not rebut closing arguments. However, we can take a note of where we are and pick up there again when next time we meet. So I want to just, for my own closing at the moment, say thank you to both of you for coming on and speaking your truth with such passion and integrity. I sense integrity on both sides. And there's a lot to absorb, a lot to learn. While you both were talking, I was trying to hurriedly take a crash course in chemistry, biology, anthropology, weaving. This is all very technical stuff, I'm afraid. That I did not complete my online course. So I am going to have to go back and listen to some of this again. I am preparing to hopefully have a conversation with Darren on some of this because I suspect he understands more than I did. But what I do understand is that you both have made fantastic case and representation for your sides on this sometime around the Easter weekend. I can't imagine a more worthy tribute to this celebration than a deep dive into the Shroud. So thank you again, and we will see you next time.
Okay.
Thanks so much, and thank you, Hugh.
And thanks, Teddy. It's good fun talking to you.
Yes.
It's good people who are excited about things and not just boring.
Yes, absolutely.